What do we mean by the supernatural? We as Christians can take those words for granted, and we think whether we know what those words actually mean and how we define them. But we can talk some sort of Christianese kind of language. We all understand what we mean, but from the outside looking in, it can seem quite confusing. This was relevant because we received a comment on one of our videos from an atheist who was interested in Christianity and wanted to know what we mean by the word supernatural, what we mean by the word miracle. Of course, we've just celebrated Easter recently and we are still in that midst, and it can be quite confusing when we are throwing around the idea that a man physically died and rose again. For an atheist, for a naturalist, that sounds like a crazy idea, but in fact, it's something that we really believe. So what do we mean by a miracle, and can miracles happen today? Well, I've gathered a few sources, 2 from non-Christians and then 1 from a Christian philosopher, and we can see if one definition is better than the other. There are many out there, and if you wanted to comment down below and let me know what you think should be the best definition of the word miracle or supernatural, please let me know and we can have a conversation about that. But let's look at the first definition that we have. Yes, of course, we cannot start this conversation without going to Scottish philosopher David Hume. Although he died in 1776, he does seem to resurrect from time and again. He wrote a very short but very profound and famous essay called Of Miracles that is still used today. He defines a miracle like this. He says, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. He also says that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavours to establish. You also see there that I've got Bart Ehrman, New Testament critic and skeptic, who has written a lot about miracles and the resurrection in more of his popular level work. He says in his book Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, he says, it is probably better not to speak of violations of laws, so he is contrary to Hume in that sense, but to think of miracles as events that contradict the normal workings of nature in such a way as to be virtually beyond belief and to require an acknowledgement that supernatural forces have been at work. So, that seems like a fair understanding of what a miracle might be. Perhaps we don't want to say that it violates the laws, but it perhaps contradicts the normal way that we think nature works. And to be virtually beyond belief within the normal workings of nature, that must require us to point to a supernatural force or a non-natural force, because naturalism couldn't make this happen. But Ehrman goes a little step further that I think changes the nuance a little bit. He responds to his critics who say that he essentially regurgitates Hume. He says, I don't regurgitate Hume as a historian, although that's quite controversial, but as a historian, he says that we can't dabble within the supernatural forces. We can't look back in history and make a judgment call about whether a miracle happened or not, because we simply don't know. Because miracles are always the least likely explanation. He says here, to use another one of his quotes, establish what probably happened on the basis of whatever supporting evidence happens to survive. That would seem to be true. They can never demonstrate that a miracle probably happened. Now that seems to me to be very, very similar to what David Hume says in this quote right here, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact, which it endeavours to establish. Now, Ehrman may come back and say, no, I'm not denying that miracles can happen. I'm not denying that. Hume is denying that. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is that when you look at a historical event that seems to suggest that a miracle happened, historians can only work within the realm of probabilities. And because within the realm of probabilities, a miracle is always the least likely explanation of any event, a miracle probably didn't happen. Or, to be a little bit softer, we can never know if a miracle ever happened. Let's have a look at Ehrman's quote again and see if we have interpreted him correctly here. He says, since historians can only establish what probably did happen in the past, and the chances of a miracle happening by definition are infinitesimally remote, it's so unlikely that a miracle has happened, because a miracle is a miracle, right? It's always the least likely explanation. They can never demonstrate that a miracle probably happened. I remember watching a debate between Bart Ehrman and Dr. William Lane Craig, and he says quite openly that no, he doesn't think that the disciples stole the body, but it's more likely than a miracle, because a miracle is less likely than a naturalistic explanation. He would say, no, I don't think that Jesus' body was probably just taken down and dumped into a pit. He may have changed his nuance there. I think, and I could be wrong for anyone who are Ehrman followers, I think he would maybe think that Jesus' body was just left on the cross, because that's what Romans typically did. There is evidence to suggest that in Roman times they did bring victims down from the cross and bury them as well, but that's not the point we're trying to make here. So even if he says that no, I don't think that actually happened, but it's more likely that that happened than the resurrection. Is that fair? Is that a fair interpretation of what miracles are? Let's look at one more definition and let's see if we can tie any pieces together and evaluate these claims, and let me know what you think down below. So let's go to another one. So the last source we're going to look at is by philosopher J.P. Moreland, who is a Christian, and he defines a miracle like this. He says, what is the point of looking at these three definitions? Firstly, I think we can see a similarity between Christians and non-Christians who have thought about what miracles mean and what miracles and the supernatural are. Miracle, or supernatural event, is something that contradicts or supersedes, or even if we want to use a Humean definition, violates the normal workings of nature. We understand how nature works, but when something happens contrary to the workings of nature, it seems to force us to point towards some sort of external force that is imposing themselves on the normal workings of nature and how we understand them. There seems to be a similarity there. But secondly, the debate is whether we can ever establish if a miracle actually happened. Now, I would encourage anyone, Christian, non-Christian alike, to go and grab a copy of Craig Keener's 2-volume work on miracles. He is a Christian. He is, of course, therefore open to the supernatural. But he writes down in 2 massive volumes modern-day documented miracles that have happened. That there is literally no other explanation to best explain what happened. For example, complete healings of people with stage 4 cancer. They've received prayer, and after going back to the doctor to get a scan, all of the cancer is gone. And it's such a miracle that there isn't even a trace, there isn't even a history of cancer. They're so healed that it doesn't even look like they had cancer to begin with. J.P. Moreland mentions a similar story in his work as well. So it would seem to suggest that even though the historians are in the realm of probabilities, and that would be correct, why cannot we say that a miracle probably happened if it would seem to suggest that the miracle is the best explanation of a particular miracle claim, of a specific historical event? If we can use modern day examples, which are documented from different sources, from different people, from those in authority, from eyewitnesses, for those that you would trust, different types of people, from enemies, from followers. If the evidence seems to point towards the supernatural, why are we bound by a naturalistic explanation? If the evidence is so good and points us really, really close to a supernatural event, to a supernatural explanation, to a miracle, but we're forced to remain within a naturalistic explanation because, like Ehrman says, a miracle is always, by definition, the least likely explanation, then why would we settle for a very poor natural explanation if a possibility of a miracle explains it better? If we reject that line of reasoning, it doesn't seem to be an historical problem, it seems to be a philosophical one, which is why Ehrman continues to have his critics that suggests that he is doing nothing more than regurgitating Hume and just presenting it in a slightly different way. Now, for me, I have to acknowledge my own bias. I'm a Christian, I believe God exists, therefore I'm far more open to the possibility of miracles. So if you are a skeptic and watching this but open to the possibility of miracles, what I would have you do is sincerely read the Gospels, read the New Testament, and see if you can come up with a better explanation than the supernatural one, which is Jesus physically rose from the dead. If that's too much, go to modern day miracle claims. Look at the sources. Look at the doctors who openly say, cannot explain this, it must be a miracle. If you get closer to the possibility that miracles happen, and miracles can happen, I would encourage you to take that one step further and take it very, very seriously indeed. If you dismiss it and say, no, miracles just don't happen, again, it's a philosophical problem. Perhaps you need to look at the arguments that we can use that seems to point towards a creator, a designer, that seems to point towards God's existence. And then within that framework, we can look at miracle claims. But I think this is an important distinction between a Humean definition, an Ehrman definition, and a Christian definition. Just because we're open to miracles, to the possibility of them at least, doesn't mean that we're looking at evidence blindly. We are looking at the evidence well, with good and well-trained eyes, as best as we can, of course. And yes, I would even say that the idea of Jesus rising from the dead is still a probabilistic outcome. We are dealing with historical probabilities. But what I would say is that looking at the data, looking at the New Testaments, the best possible explanation, the best possible probability is that Jesus physically rose from the dead. And if we don't allow ourselves to come to that conclusion, because we have already, philosophically, we have presupposed that miracles cannot happen, then of course we're never going to be able to look at the data with as an open eye as possible, with as much neutrality as possible. And if you're in that position, I don't think that we're looking at the data and the evidence fairly. So I would push back on someone there and say, I think, just like I have a bias, but I think your bias there is forcing you to not even approach the subject. So that's how I would look at the definition of miracles. Interestingly, I've used two non-Christian sources. I've seen some overlap with the Christian source, but I think it really does come down to philosophical presuppositions, philosophical ideas. And if you're in that place, you need to dive into the arguments for the existence of God, do that. But if your philosophical bias is forcing you not to allow yourself to look at the data, I would ask you, cautiously, to look at your bias, see if there's any hindrance there, and see if you can come up with a better explanation than a supernatural one for miracle claims in the past and miracle claims today.